What finally breaks smart students isn't difficulty. It isn't pressure. It isn't competition. It's the quiet death of curiosity. And the strange thing is, it usually happens while everyone is applauding. When children are young, they ask questions constantly. Not polite questions, annoying questions. Why is the sky blue? Why does this fall? Why does that move? Why does it stop? They don't care if the question sounds stupid. They don't care if it interrupts the lesson. They don't care if there's an answer. They're not performing, they're exploring. Somewhere along the way, that stops. It stops when questions become risky, when asking the wrong thing wastes time, when curiosity slows the class down, when not knowing becomes embarrassing, when grades start to matter more than understanding. The child learns a new rule. Don't ask what isn't required. Smart students learn this rule faster than anyone else. They learn which questions are safe, which ones get praise, which ones show intelligence without threatening authority. They learn how to appear curious without actually being curious. They become excellent at intellectual theater. But curiosity is not theater. Curiosity is stubborn. It doesn't care about schedules. It doesn't care about exams. It doesn't care about approval. It wants to know what's really going on, even if that knowledge is inconvenient. School slowly replaces that instinct with something else, efficiency. Efficiency sounds good, it feels adult, but efficient learning is often shallow learning. You get just enough understanding to move on, not enough to build intuition. You solve problems without ever asking whether the problem makes sense. You accept assumptions without ever testing them. Smart students survive this process because they're adaptable, but survival isn't the same as growth. When these students reach the real world, curiosity is suddenly required again. No one tells you what the problem is. No one guarantees there is a solution. No one checks your work before consequences arrive. And many smart students don't know how to begin because they've never practiced thinking without permission. They wait for clarity. They wait for instructions. They wait for validation. Real thinkers don't wait. Real thinking starts with admitting confusion, not publicly, not performatively, privately, and honestly. It starts with saying, "I don't understand this yet," not as a weakness, but as a signal. That sentence is the doorway to understanding. School teaches you to avoid it. Science is built on it. When I worked on problems, I didn't start with equations. I started with pictures, with stories, with crude models that were probably wrong. I asked myself what had to be true for this thing to behave the way it does. I made guesses. I tested them. I threw them away when they failed. That process looks sloppy from the outside. It doesn't look intelligent. There's no smoothness, no elegance, just a lot of wrestling with ideas. School rarely shows students this part. It shows the finished product, the polished proof, the clean derivation, the final answer. Students never see the confusion that came before it, so they assume confusion means failure. In reality, confusion is evidence you're doing real work. Another thing real thinkers do is reduce problems to their simplest form, not because simple is easy, but because simplicity reveals structure. Smart students often do the opposite. They make things complicated because complication looks impressive. They hide uncertainty behind complexity. Nature doesn't care how impressive your method looks. It cares whether your idea matches reality. I used to tell students, if you can't explain something in simple terms, you don't understand it. Not because simplicity is superior, but because understanding compresses information. It strips away what doesn't matter. It leaves only what does. School trains expansion, more words, more steps, more jargon, more decoration. That's useful for grading. It's useless for thinking. Real thinking also requires a strange kind of courage, the courage to be wrong without collapsing. Smart students are often terrified of being wrong because their identity is built on being correct. When correctness disappears, so does confidence. But being wrong is not a flaw in thinking, it's the mechanism. Every good idea I ever had started as a bad one that survived longer than the others. The difference wasn't intelligence, it was persistence and honesty. I didn't protect my ideas, I attacked them. I tried to break them. If they survived, they earned my respect. School rarely teaches this relationship with ideas. Ideas are treated as possessions, not tools. You have the right answer. You lose points if you don't. That mindset is poisonous outside the classroom. In the real world, ideas are disposable. The faster you can abandon a bad one, the better you'll do. So what separates people who thrive from those who struggle isn't how much they know, it's how they deal with not knowing, whether uncertainty energizes them or paralyzes them, whether confusion feels like an invitation or a threat. Smart students are often trained to experience confusion as a threat. Real thinkers experience it as a signal that something interesting is nearby. If I were to redesign education, I wouldn't add more content. I'd remove most of it. I'd slow everything down. I'd reward good questions more than correct answers. I'd make students explain ideas to each other in plain language. I'd let them fail openly and safely. I'd show them unfinished thinking. Because the real world doesn't reward brilliance, it rewards judgment. And judgment comes from wrestling with reality, not memorizing descriptions of it. The tragedy isn't that smart students fail, it's that many of them were never taught how to succeed outside the artificial game of school. They were trained to perform intelligence, not to practice it. Thinking is not a talent, it's a habit, and habits are formed by what you practice. School practices answers. The real world demands understanding, and that difference is everything. One of the strangest things about school is that it claims to teach thinking, yet it is built almost entirely to prevent it. That sounds harsh, but look closely. The structure itself tells the story. There's a right answer, a wrong answer, and a narrow path in between. The teacher knows the destination in advance. The exam confirms whether you arrived there, and the student's job is not to explore, but to comply. Real thinking does not work that way. When I was teaching, I noticed that students were terrified of open questions, not difficult questions, open ones. Questions where the answer wasn't printed somewhere. Questions where you had to decide what mattered before you could even begin. That fear didn't come from nowhere. It was trained. In school, curiosity is tolerated only when it stays inside the syllabus. Ask why something works within the lesson and you're praised. Ask why the lesson exists at all and you're a problem. Ask why the assumptions are what they are and you're wasting time. The system has places to go. Thinking that slows it down is inefficient. So students learn something subtle but powerful. Don't ask questions that disturb the flow. Instead, they learn to wait for instructions. They learn to look for cues. They learn to reverse engineer what the examiner wants and give it back. That's not stupidity, it's adaptation. The system rewards it. But thinking is not about following instructions. Thinking is about choosing instructions when none are given. In the real world, nobody hands you a neatly labeled problem. There is no chapter heading that says, this is a momentum question, or this is a moral dilemma, or this is a systems failure. Reality just happens, and you have to decide where to look, what to ignore, what might matter, and what probably doesn't. School rarely practices that skill. Instead, it teaches students that intelligence means speed. Finish faster, answer quicker, move on. There is very little reward for stopping and saying, wait, does this even make sense? In fact, that question is often dangerous. It suggests doubt. Doubt suggests weakness. Weakness threatens grades. So smart students become smooth. They become fluent. They become excellent at producing acceptable answers without ever asking whether the question itself is flawed. This works beautifully in school. It fails spectacularly everywhere else. I saw this clearly in physics. Students could solve extremely complicated equations, but they had no intuition for what the equation meant. They could manipulate symbols for hours without noticing that the result violated common sense, and when you pointed it out, they didn't argue, they froze. The formula had spoken. Reality, apparently, was wrong. That's not thinking, that's obedience to symbols. Real thinking is messy. It involves false starts. It involves trying an idea, watching it fail, and then asking why it failed instead of hiding the failure. School discourages this because failure is expensive. It lowers averages. It hurts rankings. It creates administrative discomfort. So failure is minimized, risk is avoided, exploration is replaced with rehearsal. Another thing school does very well is separate knowledge into boxes. Math here, physics there, history over there, each with its own language, its own rituals, its own tests. Students learn to switch modes rather than integrate ideas. They learn that thinking happens in compartments. Reality doesn't have compartments. In the real world, problems spill across boundaries. Technical problems have human consequences. Economic decisions have psychological effects. Scientific discoveries raise ethical questions. But students trained in isolation struggle to connect these dots. They wait for permission to cross lines that don't exist. Smart students especially become prisoners of this structure. They are rewarded so consistently for staying inside the box that they never learn how to step outside it. And when they finally must, when the job is ambiguous, when the rules are unclear, when the authority doesn't know the answer, they feel lost. They mistake uncertainty for incompetence. But uncertainty is the starting point of thinking. It's where all real understanding begins. The universe doesn't hand out clear instructions. It hands out puzzles and waits to see what you do. School also teaches students to trust authority over evidence. If the textbook says it, it must be true. If the teacher confirms it, it must be right. This is efficient. It saves time. It also trains passivity. Science does not work this way. Nature does not care who said something or how respected they are. An idea is either consistent with reality or it isn't, and the only way to find out is to test it. Smart students often struggle with this transition. They're used to asking, "Is this what you want?" instead of, "Is this actually true?" Those are very different questions. One is social, the other is intellectual. School prioritizes the social question because it's easier to manage, but the real world prioritizes the intellectual one because it's unavoidable. The tragedy is that many smart students don't realize what's happening until much later. They think something has gone wrong with them. They were excellent students. Why is everything so unclear now? Why don't the answers come? Why doesn't effort guarantee success anymore? The answer is uncomfortable. Effort was never the key. Thinking was, and thinking was never properly trained. School trained performance under known conditions. The real world demands judgment under unknown ones. Until that difference is understood, intelligence becomes a fragile thing. It works only when the environment cooperates, and the environment rarely does. People used to call me a genius. I never liked that word. It gives the wrong impression. It makes people think there's some mysterious substance inside certain heads that others don't have, as if understanding is a talent you're born with, like eye color. That's nonsense. What I discovered very early is that most people who are labeled smart aren't actually good at thinking at all. They're good at school, and school is a very peculiar game. When I was young, I noticed something strange. The students who got the highest grades were often the most confident. They spoke fluently, they used the right words, they could repeat definitions perfectly. But when you asked them a simple question, not a trick question, just a why, everything fell apart. The words were there, but the understanding wasn't. It was like a beautifully wrapped box with nothing inside. School trains you to mistake familiarity for comprehension. If you've seen something often enough, if you've repeated it enough times, if you can say it smoothly, you start to feel like you understand it. That feeling is incredibly convincing, and it's completely unreliable. I used to test this. I'd ask students what energy is. They'd say, "Energy is the ability to do work." Fine. Then I'd ask, "What is work?" Silence. Or worse, more words, circular words, definitions that chase each other in loops. They had learned the language of physics without learning the physics. That's the first trap smart students fall into. They learn symbols instead of realities. They learn names instead of mechanisms. They learn answers instead of questions. In school, if you repeat what the teacher says, you're rewarded. If you repeat it clearly, you're rewarded more. If you repeat it exactly, you're rewarded the most. So students adapt, they optimize, they become very efficient parrots, and everyone applauds because the system is doing exactly what it was designed to do. But the real world doesn't care how well you repeat things. Nature doesn't care. Reality doesn't care. Reality asks only one question: do you actually understand what's going on? When a bridge collapses, it doesn't ask whether the engineer got an A in structural analysis. When a business fails, it doesn't ask whether the founder memorized the textbook. When an experiment fails, it doesn't ask whether the scientist used the correct terminology. It asks whether the thinking was sound. Smart students often fail because school never forces them to confront the limits of their understanding. Exams are polite, they stay within the syllabus. They don't wander off into uncomfortable territory. They don't ask questions the teacher can't answer. They don't punish shallow understanding, they reward it. Real thinking is uncomfortable. It starts with confusion. It starts with saying, "I don't know." School trains that sentence out of you. It replaces it with a performance. Once I said that you can know the name of something without knowing anything about it. School takes that idea and builds an entire civilization on it. Students learn the names of formulas, the names of theories, the names of historical events, but names are cheap. Understanding is expensive. It costs time, it costs effort, it costs humility. The smartest students often avoid that cost. They don't need to pay it. The grades come anyway. So they move faster and faster, stacking symbols on top of symbols, never stopping to check the foundation. And because it keeps working in school, they assume it will work everywhere else. That's the dangerous part. The real world is not structured like a curriculum. Problems don't announce which chapter they belong to. They don't tell you which formula to use. They don't even tell you whether a formula exists. You have to decide what matters and what doesn't. You have to test your ideas against reality, not against an answer key. And that's where many smart students freeze. They've never practiced thinking without rails. They've never practiced being wrong in public. They've never practiced tearing an idea apart to see if it actually works. They've practiced appearing correct. That's a very different skill. Understanding isn't about being fast. It isn't about being elegant. It isn't about being impressive. It's about being honest with yourself about what you know and what you don't know. School rarely rewards that honesty. In fact, it often punishes it. So smart students leave school with a strange handicap. They're confident, articulate, credentialed, and fragile. The first time reality refuses to match the textbook, they assume something external has gone wrong. They don't realize the problem is internal. They never learned how to think when the rules disappear. And the rules always disappear.